Hello. Sorry, a little bit delay. Today, I would like to present a presentation about maybe something weird in a conference dealing with the dematerialization. That is some of the work of contemporary sound artists that are dealing with something what I would call a radical materiality, where despite that that the work is based on the procedure or the system art in the data and in the information, the work of art as it is as it's perceived by the viewer, by the guest, is more like a perception, just a phenomena, and just an experience of the purest kind. And I would like to begin with going a little bit back in time to the about 1914, when Marcel Duchamp, as he said, he was walking around the streets of Old Rouen when he spotted in the shop window famous infamous chocolate grinder. And as he wrote in his in couple interview, as he said, struck by this common mechanical mass-produced object, he realized that he wanted to depart for what he called to the point what he called a dry drawing, or the dry conception of art, to the appreciation of the value of exactness, the precision, and the importance of chance at the same time. He called this departure point for his mechanical opus magnum, that is the large glass. And in my opinion, for Duchamp, the fascination of technical drawing was an attempt to transgress beyond the mode of taste, the style that any repetition inevitably creates. Mechanical drawings, mass-produced objects are characterized by a lack of reflectiveness, automation, and constant correspondence between the procedure or the model and organization, understood as organization of movement and functions, and the final effect, that is the work of art, or like in the case of software and software art, what we see on the screen, what you hear from the speakers. The technical drawing, blueprint, design, whatever we want to call it, is of course visual and as a source for a creation. For example, like a beautiful table, in case of like IKEA furniture. But it's not itself a subject for us of aesthetic judgment. It's outside subjectivity of a taste, so it's really close to what Marcel Duchamp wanted to achieve by turning into the mechanical and technical drawing. The technical drawing is valued not as a beautiful object itself, but not as not giving aesthetic pleasure, but as accurate rendition of a principle that stays behind the production process or the finished object. And technical drawing allows the simplest, most economic and repetitive implementation at its finest version. So it exists mostly on the conceptual than the aesthetic plane. And this notion that the underlying structure, the concept, is the most important part of the artistic activity, that the artist maintains rather a notebook than with a set of procedures than a sketchbook with composition designs or some attempts to composition attempts, is of course a gateway to the conceptual art several decades later. For example, even Sol Levitt in 1967 wrote that he wanted, he understands conceptual art as some kind of dry art. So exactly the words of Marcel Duchamp were evoked there. But more important for me during this lecture is that this notion of underlying structure brought visual arts closer to the musical arts, where the script notation was ever so important, and even of course before 1960s, and after that when conceptual, even Polish conceptual art started to produce scores and notation systems that were not even impossible to play to show, but were even designed as impossible compositions. So this is in the thinking that the music is the most important part. The music is the structure, the composition, then the sound. Thinking the sound is a material of music is just a historical coloration that the music used sound as the mean of expression. But there are some musicians who don't even consider composing as a artistic practice, more like a scientific inquiry. In this case, it's bring closer music to the mathematics and to the Pythagorean tradition, which we seen even that in Robert Flutt, great musician, God as a great musician, who's realigning the world based on the monochord and the golden ratio of monochord proportions. So the thinking that the world is based on this underlying structure that is harmonical, that is it could be known, it could be learned by reflection, by scientific inquiry, was of course, as we all know, very profound until the 1600s and even beyond. But it doesn't, in my opinion, it didn't die with the Newtonian revolution. It simply just was reduced to the most important part, thinking about the universe as a model that is could be scientifically understand, not like a music as a not musica mundi, musica universalis could not be heard anyway. But it doesn't mean that the music that is based on proportion and harmonics doesn't exist in the universe. Music as the harmony of the world. And even looking on the famous famous page from Johannes Kepler, showed that the thinking about the universe as harmonical was still alive in the moment of the birth of the modern astronomy. Here we can, of course, see the tones that are made by the most important planets in our solar system. And Kepler, based on the proportion of the speed of the movement and the orbit of the planet, has counted how the planet sounds moving to the through the space. So. But this is, on the other hand, this is showing that the thinking that the music, arts, and science, like as a discursive way to understand the world, was very important. And of course, even in Athanasius Kircher, learning. Trying to learn to understand the world through the means of an art, and also trying to show that the world is rational. It's could be learned by the power of a human mind. Of course, Athanasius Kircher, as a German Jesuit working in Rome, was a big proponent of a Reformation, and in this regard, the showing that this the mechanical understanding of the world, mathematical understanding of the world, was an argument for the proponent of the God's genius in constructing this universe that we know. This is the page from Musica Universalis from 1655, and here's another. As a side note, it was. Then used a couple of years later, like 25 and 1680s, by Leibniz, who wrote about his perfect palace, when the ability to hear everything that is going in the palace of this in this perfect palace by the homeowner is a political and ontological project, like a God who can hear and see everything, So the ruler should be a person who can hear and see everything in his work. And Leibniz even cites that it's arguing that it's the Padre Kirche. He used this exact words, that is the palace made as the Padre Kirche, Father Kircher would like it to be, using these tubes and tubes to transfer sounds from one place to another, trying to amaze the person viewing it, to convince him that the God is present in the room. But with the Kant and with the Newton, the discourses have separated, and the discourse of art as giving aesthetic pleasure, and science as having allowing to understand the world has separated. But it didn't die. It came back in the 20s, came back then in the 30s, and in the 60s. And some artists, like the group Graph, has said that they try to make art. Their work is very similar to the work of a scientist, where they try to understand, using artistic practices, they try to understand some part of the world that we had. And as they wrote in 1962, that in many points our method of work and our research technique corresponds to the method and technique of the scientist. Indeed, we take as our point of departure given results already acquired, we exploit them in an experimental manner, forcing ourselves to control all possibilities and all issues. From these studies are born new bits of knowledge, no longer disparate, but codified. They will thus constitute new basis for research, which will make us progress towards our goal, knowledge of the visual phenomenon. So there's this notion that the art could not only give out some information about the world, but this information will be exact, will be true. Like theory information said us that if information is to be information, it has to be true. But this is this thinking that art can say something about the world beyond art and beyond social structures, but something about this physical aspect of the world. And in contemporary art, we can, for example, see some work of Carsten Nicolai, German label boss, musician, and visual artist. And in 2001, he constructed this installation called Snow Noise. Sorry for the resolution of the image. When he allowed the viewer to grow his own snowflake. He considered that he's made these cubes that are refrigerators, and in these cubes you can put a tube, as you can see here, which is then temperature is lowered to the minus 20 degrees Celsius, and in some point in this tube the snowflake will grow. And every snowflake is different. The process is of course the same, but every snowflake will be in some manner distinct. And it's not seen in this image, but on the other wall there were drawings of every snowflake grown in this tube, just to show the experiment in futility of trying to codify all the information that is in the world. But also it shows couple of features of Carsten Nicolai works. First, the preciseness, the aesthetic brilliance. For example, like it's very aesthetically planned work, but it's very precise. It's very well designed and very scrupulously, very comprehensively made as a mechanical object. But in pushing the artistic, in pushing those scientific procedures to the boundary until the point they're gonna break. And in an interview about the Snow Noise, Carsten Nicolai said that is interested that the snowflakes only could be made, could grow on some point of noise, on some point of dirt or particle that are gonna be a starting point for growing those seemingly perfect crystals. So he's tried to show that even in the most perfectly well-designed procedure, the growing of the seemingly perfect symmetrical, supersymmetrical crystals could be only achieved when some kind of noise, some kind of interference, some kind of imperfection shows inside the seemingly perfect structure. Here's one of the grown crystals. And the notion about this imperfection inside of the perfect procedure, perfect system, is also noticeable in the work Anti that he made in 2004, when this monumental sculpture, so over 3 meters high, it's painted, covered with the black light-absorbing paint, and have and inside it is the theremin module that makes very low, not very loud, but very low and deeply disturbing noises, reacting to the people that are running around it and viewing it. So it interacts with a viewer, but also try to discourage him, try to scare him. And it is, of course, based on the Melancholia by Albert Dürer, but it's related to it more in more than just visual way. For example, Panofsky and many others try to argue what kind of geometric figure is that, because it have some problems with trying to reconstruct it as a physical object. But also, Melancholia 1, it shows the conflict between the human ability of creative power of the human being and his power of his reflection and his mind, shown by the geometry that is represented by this sphere, by this weird figure, tetrahedron, and by the magical square above the figure. And Melancholy, who is destroying this creative capability of a human being. Nikolai tried to reconstruct this object, but painted it with, like I said, really light-absorbing paint. This is maybe a better picture. When despite being perfectly rendered three-dimensional object, it's actually really hard in the real life to see the exact shape of it, because it's not reflecting light very well and try to lose its shape as it is. It of course also shows this this problem between radical science and rational and magical thinking, because of course aside of being related to the graphic, to the print of Albert Dürer, it is also related to the Space Odyssey by Kubrick, and this giant monument that it gives knowledge to the apes on all Earth, but also is something dangerous and something not understandable by rationale. It's something from more metaphysical. And the problem with representation of this kind of stuff, this showing that not every, even the spice is perfectly codified, the amount of data and showing that the limits of human perception. It shows also in works of Ryoji Ikeda, another person from Raster Noton. This is label that Karsten Nikolai has set up in Heimnitz, and Ryoji Ikeda works with something works only with models and some concept. every project, like the thematics here, is just in most cases it's just programming that is then realized in different material forms. For this example, the thematics prototype version 2 from August of 2006 was designed to try to visualize all the data in the world in different notation systems, like we can see here. This is the prints that were made, but also made in the form of the installation, and the same data, the same procedure was installed in this structure. But also, as Carsten Nicolai and Ikeda are both really focused on the experience the viewer has. And in case of Matrix, another project from Ikeda, this installation is from Museum of Contemporary Art in Tokyo from 2009, but actually Matrix was realized in at least 3 more times in different setups. It's just a white noise that is emitted in the different setups of speaker systems, different spaces. And only one person, in most cases, only one person is allowed to experience this installation. And every realization of this project, every space is different, and every experience is different because of the acoustics, because of the body of the viewer itself. So it's absolutely impossible to actually experience this this installation as a pure concept. Nonetheless, that white noise is actually not calculable itself. It should be actually it should be random. So only the experience, only the physical the physical interaction with object can give us. This project could be only realized as in the space, showing that this problem that in numerical immateriality of music, of mathematics, because as is like the Gödel said, and most physics now agree that the world is the universe that we encounter is just a realization of mathematical concept, of mathematical structure. So this as Ikeda shown us, that we can't have this ability to experience the world itself, the structure that that the world is built. We can only have the access to the phenomena and the concrete situation. But building the spaces of sound, showing this problem between numerical immateriality of music and the very material aspect of sound, who can only exist in the space and in the time, was beginning in the 1970s when Leitner made his sound spaces. And as we can see, visually the project is very similar to the work of Ikeda. That we can have some structures, some propositions, some models, how the sound is working in the space. And then just 2 different projects, but them working the same way actually. Then we have this actual realization. And what also Ikeda, Nicolai, and Leitner tried to show, that the experience of that the sound, that this installation are realigning us into the world, realigned as David Keenan, British author and monographer of British industrial music, said about experiments in the 80s that were based on between New Age and between this primitive and magical thinking that was profound in the late 70s and 80s, that the role of the magical thinking is try to realign us to the world, to the experience world as itself, that is not based on scientific and reflective matter. So even if all the installations are perfectly engineered and based on software and procedures, The only what's matter is this experience of the world, the space, and time itself. And this couldn't be more evident in the static balance, another installation by Nikolai from 2007, where only two parabolic mirrors are set up facing each other, and an emitter of white noise similar to the matrix from Ikeda are set up. And every body, every acoustic situation changes the experience of the work itself. That's another picture of that. And if the sound and the sound and the experience and the installation, the work of art exists only when it's listened in the concrete space and concrete material relations. I'm running out of time, so just gonna show its installation by Michael Brewster, so it's 1977, called Clicker Drawing, when he actually made an installation, sound installation that it should be that is completely quiet. Clicker drawing, like he installed in the walls, as we can see here, some clickers. Very simple mechanical objects that are just making this click sounds for in intervals, and distributed in the space of the gallery in Los Angeles, trying to make some precise movement of making a line in the space by timing, precise timing of the clickers, by making them in concrete space. But the problem was, and problem for the viewer, but actually point of Michael Brewster, that the precision couldn't be maintained because those clickers have only toleration about 5% or 15%. So the installation couldn't, the drawing, the experience will change because of the mechanical and mathematical imperfection of this concrete structure. This is another installation, but it's basically the same concept. So the problem with this mathematical structures are, even if they're perfect, but in the case of Michael Brewster they weren't, they couldn't be realized as perfect in the material world. So we can base our material phenomena world as a error, as a glitch inside this mathematical perfection system. And point of that is in another German-speaking artist, Simon from Switzerland, who makes very simple blocks of mostly the same, always the same, as you can see here, the same objects, the same materials. This is mostly cardboard, who works a percussion instrument, then a DC motor who's just turning around a wire or a cotton ball to make sound, and they frantically multiply it in different arrangements in different places, trying to achieve some kind of just emergent values of experience this concrete experience. This is actually a really nice piece from San Nicola in Caen. Just making this different, a little bit magical, primitive, you could say, experience of pure chaos and sound. And I would like to end with a quotation from Agnes Denes, a feminist artist from the 60s and 70s, who was very really influenced by quantum physics and the problem between Newtonian paradigm and Einstein paradigm of physics, where as Duchamp wanted to, the Einstein physics have stopped dealing with the certainty and allowed to have something about the chance. In Agnes Denes' works, she works in her opinion, event is the only reality. So real is the only thing that's real. It's the thing that's happening right now. While the reality we perceive is forever changing and transforming in an expanding evolutionary universe in which time, space, mass, energy are all interconnected and interdependent. And the other quotations, the change is the fourth dimension, time is only a measuring device. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your lecture, and we have one more in this session. The next speaker is Professor Krzysztof Moraczewski, who is not art historian, he is a specialist in cultural studies. He's professor of the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań, and he is interested in the theory of culture and also on the musical culture. So, please, your...
First, I'd like to thank for an invitation and to say that my paper, unluckily, will not be historically detailed enough. But when I tried to make it detailed enough, it started to look more like a book than a paper. So I had to rewrite it with much lesser number of details. Traditional ontologies of the work of music, aiming for the description of its existence, either had to accept some form of immaterialism, or, if trying to avoid immaterialism altogether, provided us with half-walked and unsatisfying solutions. The first possibility includes openly idealistic theories, presenting the work of music as a kind of Platonic entity, an ideal object, and phenomenological propositions, usually based upon some interpretation of Max Scheller's concept of an intentional object. A widely known representative of the latter is Roman Ingarden's conception, already mentioned in our first paper today by Professor Baus, elucidated in Work of Music and Its Identity. As an example of unconvincing proposition, but trying to remain within boundaries of formal set theory ontology, we could use the conception proposed by Nelson Goodman, elucidated in short form in his known essay, Variation Upon Variations, Picasso Back to Bach. Truly, it's difficult to be convinced by a statement that musical work simply consists of some number of performances, mainly because such a statement provokes unavoidable paradoxes. How can one determine which performances supposedly form a separate individual work of music without a priorly given tool to recognize the identity of performances? Such a tool may be the work of music itself only. Ultimately then, a work of music, supposed to consist of a number of performances, must be given priorly to these performances, one way or another, under a threat of impossibility of proper choice of valid performances. Goodman's reasoning represents then a classical example of logical vicious circle. And I'm not saying this with a purpose of criticism, nor to point out some Goodman's fault, but to illustrate a kind of trouble one can expect when trying to avoid immaterialism in the ontology of music. Even if one is such a fascinating philosopher as Nelson Goodman and the author of Languages of Art, one of the crucial works of 20th century aesthetics. Roman Ingarden, as it is known, tried to solve this problem in a different way. He differentiated between the performance or record, score of musical work and the work itself, understanding the latter as a schematic, intentional object that is intersubjectively accessible thanks to the acoustic qualities of performance, its material basis of existence, or thanks to the semiotic qualities of the score, the basis of duration. But the score, for Ingarden, makes the work of music accessible cognitively, but not aesthetically. If the work of music is an intentional object, It has the source of its existence in founding intentional acts of human consciousness and cannot be identified with any of the material objects or events that make the work accessible. The argument is valid for at least music and literature. No singular performance and no individual printed score can be identified with Symphony in G by Mozart, just as no individual printed book or digital file can be identified with Dr. Faustus by Thomas Mann. For all these material items, the actual work of art is always the other. It's tempting to say that this situation is an effect of reproducibility of the material basis of the work, in opposition to the works of art equipped with unreproducible basis, like a painting or a statue. We could continue in Gardner's question then and ask in reverse, isn't the unreproducibility of a painting or a statue leading to a common illusion, and Gardner is not avoiding this conclusion, that a material painting or a material statue is a work of art itself? And maybe we should still treat the work of art as an intentional object, accessible only thanks to a painting or a statue. The work of Andy Warhol, for example, justifies such questions strongly enough. These traditional ontologies of the work of music, including the one proposed by Ingarden, rapidly lose their credibility today. There are reasons for this. First, and above all, these ontologies of music place the work of music out of any society, any culture, as if they were not created by people. And every human person, his or her every practice and every effect of such a practice is always socioculturally involved. It's a truism of social sciences that cannot be avoided anymore. Second, these traditional ontologies are I dare say, shamelessly ethnocentric. They put all the emphasis on a particular musical practice, that of Western composers, and universalize the traits of this particular practice, treating these traits as a characteristic of a universally valid ontology of music. It's not like these traditional ontologies are simply unaware of the existence of differently structured musical practices. It would be ridiculous to assume that Ingarden was unaware of the existence of non-European musical practices or of the forms of music practiced by European peasantry. It's the matter of axiological decision, which elevates the music of European composers to the level of obliging pattern, or better, to the level of music per se, the only musical practice that exhibits the essence of music itself. Compared to it, all other forms of music represent different modi privativi of music. There is no need to argue today that this ontological decision is no longer easily acceptable, as it obviously legitimates a double order of violence. First, the advantage of force, which allows the West to force its political, military, economic, and symbolic hierarchies on the rest of the world. The advantage of European music cannot be separated from other Western advantages. It's quite saddening, however, that Westerners started to question this status of their own music not before the rest of the world managed to challenge economic and military rule of the West. Second, the acceptance of obliging or essential character of European composers' music legitimates the internal hierarchies of power of Western societies, because the ontologically decisive is exactly the same that the people at the peak of hierarchy use as a sign of social distinction. If a critique of ideologies is still a crucial part of the heritage of the Enlightenment, also this ideology shouldn't be left untouched. These traditional ontologies of music prove to be strikingly ineffective when confronted with musical practices different than, to use John Blacking's expression, the ethnic music of white elites. It's difficult to imagine how, for example, one could interpret, in Ingarden's terms, those musical practices that don't include the category of musical work at all. Let's briefly look at the example of classical Persian music. It's based upon the set of the so-called gazdah, the musical matrices determining the order of pitch, melodic formula, etc. Simplifying, we could say that every gazdah is a partial, at least partial, sound system. But gazdah is not presented in the shape of a theory, though, but as a row of so-called gushe, practical musical formulas that must be developed and worked out, often in an improvisatory way, in a practical performance. Gushe is a musical nucleus. When performing a given gazdah, the musician chooses some of gushe, omits another, repeats yet another, and elaborates them. Thanks to these procedures, there appears an actually sounding structure called radif. In all this sophisticated construction of classical Persian music, where exactly one finds and the equivalent of European work of music? The honest answer is nowhere. How then could we interpret this music in Ingarden's terms? To recognize, for example, radif as the proper object of such interpretation would be a really far-going cultural imputation. We would probably find no reasonable anthropologist to accept it. And classical Persian music is just an example. We could use many other examples. The Hindustani concept of raga, the concept of wandering verses in Mississippi blues, on the music of European peasants, in which the walk, as Laszlo Dobzai describes it, is always a construction of ethnomusicologists, a model, while in the field there are only variants. There are then strong reasons to mistrust traditional ontologies of music. A limited trust is but not the constatation of uselessness. Traditional ontologies of music must be rather properly situated, read anew without a tendency to universalization, but with a care to properly determine their field of validity. It's a matter of proper lecture to understand them not exactly as ontologies, but rather as partial theories and descriptions of a specific music culture. Estimating their field of validity is so important because we cannot assume a priori that they are valid only for Western composers' music. In 19th century Japanese koto or show music, we find many characteristics more than similar to Western music. In koto music, we should be careful to not identify it with Japanese music in general. There are musical works considered to be something different than any given performance of this work. The works are individual items that preserve their identity through performances, not generative matrices like raga, for example. Finally, just like in Europe, the works are carefully linked with the individual authors whose names are remembered and venerated. Similarity is deep. So deep that analytic methods created specifically for elite Western music were successfully applied to Japanese koto music, including even Schenkerian analysis. It was enough to assume that koto work is not a projection of harmonic triad, but a projection of pentatonic scale. We could probably find more such examples. The proper question is then, what is a common denominator of those musical practices that can be properly described by non-materialistic ontologies in the type of Roman Ingarden? Let's present our hypothesis then. The common denominator is musical literacy, and the chasm between sounding, then material performance, and the ideal work of music belongs to the effects of literacy. We find ourselves, of course, in the middle of the research field opened by Richard Taraskin and his Oxford History of Western Music. But to continue our discourse, we must put emphasis on one crucial distinction. Sociologists and social historians make all decisive distinction between societies including slavery and societies based on slavery. It is structurally determined by slavery. Our topic is not that dread, but analogically, we have to distinguish music cultures containing notation and music cultures based upon notation. For the latter, let's use Taraskin's term, literate music. Literate music is then, for us, such a music that not only is being notated, but is its characteristics determined by the effects of literacy. A good example of music practice that included notation but was not based upon it is ancient Greek music, as far as we know it. Greek musical notation using the letters of Greek alphabet, but also reversed and mirrored letters, allowed for a precise notation of intervals, but not of exact pitch. This will be a problem till 18th century, rhythm or temp. Thanks to these qualities of notation, a proper performance of preserved Greek music is not truly possible, and existing reconstructions and recordings are always more or less a phantasmagory. It's not the matter of musicologists or performers lacking skills. It's a matter of semiotic characteristics of Greek notation itself. Such a situation can be explained in two ways. First, that the transmission and dissemination of Greek music was generally still oral, and the notation was used as an occasional mnemotechnics or as a mean of special commemoration. To fully read a piece of music notated in a Greek way, you may still need first to know the piece of music. Second, it's striking that Greek musical notation captures exactly these qualities of music that Greek philosophy was so keenly interested in, the proportions governing the order of intervals, analyzed in Pythagorean and Platonic tradition. For these philosophical purposes, the Greek notation was, well, perfect enough. The same situation we find in classical Arab music, although philosophical analysis of music that we find in Arab world is using a proper notation, based upon Greek notation, by the way. It seems, this notation seems to bear no significance for practical music making. Professional Arab musicians interviewed by Viotto in Egypt at the end of 18th century were not even aware of the existence of any musical notation. Nothing surprising, as they were professional musicians, not professional philosophers. If some form of music becomes truly literate, the situation changes dramatically. There is no need to follow here Taraskin's multi-volume analysis of the musical effects of literacy. Since its publication in 2005, it was led even further by other authors. It's sufficient to put emphasis on some of them, linked with the birth of immaterialistic ontology of music. I choose here four of them: spatialization, intellectualization, dematerialization, and reification. Spatialization is a process of substitution of space in a place of time. Before writing, music happens in time. Temporality is its most striking aspect, and shaping time by the means of sound, it's probably its essence. Sound is both duration and passing. The structure of temporal relations between sounds form what we used to call the musical time, so fascinatingly analyzed by Gisèle Briselet. It's different time of inner rules, and only a person alien to music measures the musical time in seconds and minutes, instead of bars, talas, taleas, phrases, etc. Musical time is a structure of sound events that is captured by the mean of memory. When notation stops to be simply a tool for ex post analysis, but starts to be used as a tool of creating music, everything changes. Whatever will be performed in time must be now priorly be planned in space. Writing takes space. Annotated, spatial work of music may still be thought of as a set of performative instructions that allows to translate space back to time. I think Ingarden recognized it when he wrote not about temporality, but what he called quasi-temporality of music, also of literature. And in the context of writing, it's hardly surprising. Temporality is then a quality of performance, never identical with a work, while temporality of musical work is only potential. But it's also possible, more radically, to think about spatial relations prescribed in a score as of sufficient characteristic of a musical work itself. From this point of view, as Igor Stravinsky said, to perform is to deform. There's nothing extravagant then when Milton Babbitt openly denies the necessity of performing and listening in famous essay, Who Cares If You Listen? In specialized music, some planned relations cannot be effectively translated back to time, and some, like German Augenmusik, can exist only in writing. A new class of object appears in the world, a class unknown to the oral musical traditions. Intellectualization is the term I use to describe a process during which a knowledge, and pure knowledge, is becoming a workshop of a composer. A jazzman or a Hindustani musician cannot break up with the physicality of music, with the effort of hands and throats. But a composer, idealizing, works by manipulating intellectual symbols to create an intellectual order. It's imaginable that a person composing lacks performative musical skills at all. Nobody requires a composer to be able to play all music. Who can play 100-person orchestra anyway? The work is, just like a scientific theory, presented as a text. In this situation, music can be, but doesn't have to be, effectively de-aesthetized. One may think, like Beethoven or Lutosławski, still about planning, ultimately, the aesthetic experience of the listener. But nothing stops us from thinking like Jean Ockeghem in the 15th century or Anton Webern, that qualities of music are of intellectual character, and there is no need to experience them aesthetically. Such experience may be even unwanted. There are counterpoints in Ockeghem's music so complex that no human ear can hear them anyway. Intellectualized music closest to the border of the theory of music, but it's a different topic. Spatialization and intellectualization together affect in dematerialization of music. No sensually accessible item, no score in its materiality, no sounding performance is identical with a musical work. A work is only presented or signified by the material means. The work itself is present only thanks to the process of abstraction from always lacking material experiences. Work of music is an eidos in relation to scores and performances. This new immaterial being, the work of music, is legitimated thanks to the interpretation in terms of idealistic philosophy and theology. For Immanuel Kant, music is still an organization of sensuality and is still the matter of aesthetics. But for Schelling, the sensual in music is already only a particular existence of an idea, and for Hegel, only an appearance through which shines the truth of the reason. Even Edward Hanslick, in first edition of Vom Musikalisation, 1854, interpreted the absolute music in theological terms. He removed this fragment in second edition. Legitimation was probably no longer needed. Meanwhile, the German philosophy of 19th century transformed the belief in immaterial essence of music, in its religious justification, in a common truth, and a basic assumption for new scholarly discipline, musicology. Phenomenologists like Ingarden could reinterpret this philosophy of music in terms of the founding acts of human consciousness. Dematerialization is then, at the same time, reification. It may seem counterintuitive at first, as I claim that music losing its materiality is becoming a thing. But what kind of thing? Before writing, music is not a thing. Music is activity. It's sensual, it's material, it's still a humanly organized sound. It's something you do, or as Taraskin writes, something others do while you do something else. But as immaterial item represented in writing, it is not an activity anymore. It is an object, a thing, different thing than a score. It's a thing written down in a material thing we call a score. This is why ontology of music always seemed so challenging. It's ontology of immaterial thing existing differently from its material bearers. Because reification is not a state, but a process, a slow social construction of new ontological sphere. These four processes, four effects of musical literacy, initiate then the music in the meaning dearest to the elite cultures of the West. Music as an autonomous word of immaterial objects that requires properly autonomous and immaterial form of cognition. It's nothing surprising that for scholars and musicians still living in this world, any sociocultural analysis of music is either a blasphemy or simply unnecessary. Nobody needs to justify such a choice. It is enough to recognize that it's a matter of the axiological decision that chooses and affirmates a specific cultural heritage, not the matter of the essence of music. Eventually, as probably the most famous saying in contemporary philosophy of music goes, music may be what we think it is, or it may be not. But dematerialization and reification do not only found a new ontological sphere, they also found a new model, new type of market. Metaphysics and economy meet here to create a new model of marketing of immaterial objects. Let's limit ourselves to the music market from before the age of phonography. It is, above all, a market of prints, but it's obvious that not the prints themselves are being marketed here. Immaterial objects transmitted by the prints are the heart of this market. Ontological reshaping of music by the effects of literacy was maybe a crucial condition for modern music market. Before writing, not music is being marketed, but musicians, as music cannot be separated from music-making persons. It may be an explanation for the situation of Roman ancient musicians who were, in overwhelming majority, slaves and objects of trade, as the music could not be marketed separately from music-making people. And it is a vivid market. There are of course always too many musicians, but there are also always too few musicians worth listening. When writing separates musical work from a person, a composer may still act as a performer in a market of old rules, but he or she may risk a participation in a market of separated musical items. And this new type of music market will quickly become a playfield for modern capitalism. Not a musician will become a central feature of this market, nor even a merchant or a capitalist, but a lawyer. The works of music became so autonomous, so removed from the music-making persons, that the link between an author and the music must be legally guaranteed. It is the law that has to connect back the music to their authors. And this is why copyright management is now the dominating sector of music market, and by a huge margin. Musicians are owners of the rights to their own music only exceptionally. As we know, the Beatles are today a trademark of Apple Corporation, and most music of the world is being owned by Sony. Only 4 actors share today the musical market. Phonography has the power of provoking changes similar to the effects of musical literacy within the world of oral music. So a Persian radif, improvised free jazz solo, or an orally composed rock and roll song already became objects too, although in different way. Their ontology requires new research, but music industry has no need to wait for researchers. How the ontology of music and music market are mutually related is a topic for a separate study. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your very interesting paper. We have some minutes time for discussion. If I can summarize the difference between the visual arts and music, I can probably quote 2 bon mots. One of Michel Foucault, when he wrote his book about realism, he said realism is what you see is this. It is a kind of identity between the material work and what you see. And on the other side, on the side of music, I can quote Rainer Maria Rilke, Sein ist Gesang. Any question, interventions? Yes.
Thank you very much. I just want to say that those were 2 fantastic lectures, and actually I was just cheering all the time and so happy hearing lecture from Professor Moraczewski, because actually for me such attitude opens a completely different and completely indebted in time understanding of the visual arts. Actually, I think that for me the logical consequences were that there is no such link between that the visual is what it is, and I think we could talk a lot about it with people that are working at conserving and preserving the works of art that in fact are covered in time and are changing their forms. I would just I have a question, but I just want to say one more thing, that we can find and it was said, I think Jan said it earlier, we can find a different attitude also within visual studies between the structure and the effect. We can find it, for example, in sculpture. We can think, for example, of Naum Gabo, who would always date his works by the concept, by the project, not by the time of its realization. And maybe we can think about it in such more dynamic way. So I would really love to ask Professor Moraczewski to elaborate more on this complexities within the field of visual arts and the time between and the timing between the idea and realization of art within that framework of ideas.
I would still start with music to make a good start for a comparison, because in music it is also not so obvious. I try to represent a kind of ontology of music that is particular to a very specific musical culture. It is to the shaped mainly in German-speaking countries form of the vision of music that was never shared by Europeans non-elite strata of societies or non-European societies when with very small exceptions. It is also very characteristic that this extreme immaterialistic interpretation was always a thing of composers, musicologists and philosophers of music, but as far as I know it was never shared by musical performers. And this complicates the matter of timing between the concept and the realization. It depends on how would you want to determine the effective existence of a musical work. When it was conceptually created or written down by a composer, or when it started to be effective for a musical culture that it belongs to, and it is usually connected with public representation, and usually it's still, up to today, the first live performance of the work. Depending on which point of view you will take, the point of view of the active participants, listeners, performers, etc., or the point of view of a composer and intellectuals connected with these specific ideas, you will gain different answers. And I think that to be honest, I don't believe in any kind of big chasm that would divide music and visual arts. I think this chasm was created by a specific branch of the philosophy of music, but never by the musicians as themselves. But the chasm was imported in 20th century in its effects. We can easily notice that when visual avant-garde is becoming interested in music, this visual avant-garde generally, with exceptions, but generally omits the European composers' music. They look for a contact with electronic music, with jazz, rock and roll, blues, etc., as they find common ground with those musicians. So I think we do not need, I think, this separation of the theory of visual art and theory of music in general terms. We only need to separate the theory of this particular and historically very narrow, from 18th to the half of 20th century musical culture that is connected with that. So I think that this practice of dating of Gabo that you've mentioned is something that doesn't have to be linked with the situation of music. It is simply getting birth within the field of visual arts, because the processes are quite similar. I would even start much earlier, when Leonardo was asked to openly exhibit all the work sketches for Leda. So where the Leda was painted, where the painting was executed, or where all those publicly exhibited sketches were presented, were creating a work of visual art was already considered to be a long process with differently characterized points of time, and there is no simple answer which point of time was actually decisive in this process. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes?
I have a question for Professor Moraczewski, or maybe just a kind of a comment, because you said that there are certain similarities between music and visual arts, and I was thinking, well, this is a subject which is quite, I guess, a lot of people think about the dematerialization of the media, which in visual arts, with the onset of so-called media arts or well, we established that it's not probably on new media arts, it's not the best term, but generally the dematerialization in the sense of virtualization of or digitalization of visuality. And then we also have a similar parallel situation with music, which loses its material carriers, like CD or well, cassettes, CDs, and vinyl records. But recently, well, more or less recently, there is a sort of a return of interest in music and the physical carriers like vinyl records, but also in visual arts. And it's not so recent, there is this movement of archaeology of media, and there is certain interest in also this sort of, well, earlier media or more traditional media, or this archaeology of the so-called new media. Would you say, well, could you comment on if there is, do you see the parallels between, is it like a, I don't know, a valid comment on my side here?
It's undoubtedly a valid comment, but I'd like to start with commentary to your commentary, and a very short one, because it's quite a funny situation, as regaining contact with the so-called new media art, electronic music, etc., in 1940s and 1950s was described by the first composers of this music. I mean, now the composers working in Köln, like Herbert Eibert and very young Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, as the process in which, thanks to the contact with visual arts and thanks to electronic media, they claimed that they were regaining the contact with materiality. As Stockhausen was writing, look now, I'm working in electronic studio with the tape, I'm touching the sounds with my hand, just like a painter can touch a paint. I am no longer working with semiotics when I write a score. So it was quite a broad experience of trying to achieve the same form of contact with materiality that, in the eyes of the composers, painters or sculptors always had. So it is a very interesting situation, because for these composers it may be quite unpleasant surprise what happened in next decades. I am no specialist in this at all, but I would be very careful with linking the electronic media and dematerialization, as digital data always have to be recorded somewhere. There is always needed physical bearer. Ultimately, there are simply electricity. The electricity goes or goes not. There's the two possible states. I am no specialist at all, but I've heard enough times engineers protesting against any immaterialistic interpretation of digital as reality. Just something to consider. I am not absolutely sure if I'm right saying this.
Well, maybe I should address a question to Jan, since you were also presenting. But before I do so, just a very brief footnote. I don't know if this changes at all what you're just saying about the relationship of visual arts to the European avant-garde, but the fact is that minimalists and conceptual artists in New York were avid readers of Die Reihe. At least with the few issues that were translated into English, which happened somewhere around 65, 66. I think there are 2 or 3 issues that of this journal that came out in English. And beyond that, I mean, this is maybe moving more towards your talk. I think you could even argue that there was a moment there, just as there was not so much of a differentiation between a filmmaker and a visual artist in the later 60s. To a certain extent, there was not so much of a difference between a visual artist and a sound artist, as you know, there are sound pieces by many different post-minimalists, like Bruce Nauman, for instance. Even Alvin Lucier, I mean, I'm not quite sure exactly what the background is of Lucier, but I was wondering in your talk, you presented us a notion of a certain, well, maybe you can call it kind of a tactile music, but it was not fully clear to me. I mean, is this what you're trying to present in any way different from what you saw happening in what we could see as happening in the 60s, or what is the relation between the more recent projects of Geda and Carsten Nicolai, besides the fact that they overly fetishize the technology far more than the 60s artists would ever have done? What is exactly the relation to the sort of more corporalized forms of music performance that you can find in the 60s as well?
In my opinion, Nikolai and Nikita do not fetishize technology. They are actually, in my opinion, quite critical of it. In case of Nikolai likes to dwell into glitch, into mistakes, into problems inside technology, and like to explore the problems that we have by using the technology. Ikeda, on the other hand, tried to show the limits of perception and tried to show that technology could give us more data, more information that actually we can perceive and understand. So the technology, like Jacques Ellul would like to say, it's trying to suppress itself. It's trying to technology just brings more technology, and actually in some point it's so disconnected to the world and disconnected to the humanity that actually is useless. The amount of data that Ikeda is dwelling in is completely useless to anything but showing that it is. But connection to the 60s, in those installations as realizations of the projects like Matrix, because it's have couple of realizations and couple presentations, prints, couple of publications, couple of exhibitions and performances called Matrix that are based on the same principle. If we look at the 60s or the 70s, if you look at the Leitner and you look at the Max Neuhaus, the problem of experience, the sound in space, sound as a sculpturing material, it's very connected. And the static balance is actually the best example. The Anti is a piece that I really like. I think it's immensely aesthetically pleasing and really nice in experiencing as an object inside an art space. You could connect Anti to the minimalist thought of the Robert Morris, think about Gestalt, about perceiving an object, how do we make a mental image of an object. And in Anti, this is a little bit problem because using this light absorbing paint. You actually, in this piece in the gallery, you can't exactly make the shape that you're looking at because the light is just the contrast is too little on the edges. But works like Brewster, who died last year in June, I guess, trying still use a sound as a very physical, material thing inside the concrete space that occupies concrete space and concrete time, and actually can create an object inside this space. In Leitner, it would be really nice. It was very evident, in my opinion, on these two projects, the sound cube and the sound wall, when just try to rearrange the space. Space as a sounding space, acoustic space. And going back a little bit to the previous lecture about Lippard, when you said about going back to primitive and trying to the primitive object as a reconnection to the world, to the experience of the world. This is something I said David Keenan, who wrote the England Hidden Reverse, a monography about British industrial music. He considered the works of Throbbing Gristle and then Coyle as this magical practice as trying to use the technology, use glitches in Project Elf, for example, where Coil used a broken synthesizer and just put it to run and recorded everything that the broken technology, automatic technology, constructed. As a project to try to suppress the rational and suppress the mechanical thinking about the world as a machine. And in my opinion, Nikolai tried to do something the same. The installations of sound inside the space are a pure experience. They're trying to show that we are in concrete space and concrete time, in concrete event that doesn't exist beyond it. I hope this answers your question a little bit.
Okay, it is so. If we now reduce the break to 15 minutes, we will be perfectly in time. So the last question.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for two very informative lectures. Actually, while Professor Moraczewski was talking, I started formulating a question in my mind, and in fact you have answered it in the second half of the talk, because you mentioned the reproduced and transportable music as something that that asks for its own ontology. You said it might be the subject of a different paper, but you also mentioned that music will not wait for this ontology. And sorry, the music market, but probably the music itself will not wait. I mean, certainly, and so then I'm tempted to ask you to speculate, and actually this question could be directed at you as well, because I'm wondering if we move my question 2 steps ahead of this ontology, like what might be the third element that might be on the way now. I'm just curious if you have any reflection of what might come after this reproductibility.
It's probably the hardest question I could ever get. Honestly speaking, of course, I don't know, and I can only try to speculate. But I would point out a few things that became important in the last 10 years, especially last 5 years, and that were very strongly emphasized by researchers, especially researchers of music market and music industry, like Christer Malm in Sweden and a few other specialists, who point out strongly that first, the digital market, it is the market of the downloadable files, etc., and portable music, did not replace at all the traditional markets. The selling of the CDs or long plays is not less. The people are in concerts are not in less number. The reasons for this are quite difficult to establish, but we could say like this, that at least Mike Nichols and a few others write that that the people who are downloading music today, and the people who are using iPhones to listen to the music, for example, so you lose all the sensible quality of music, are usually people that never participated in any form of musical activities, and did not participate in music market. It's just like with the number of people that participates in classical European music. Today it's about 2% of the market. But the socio-historical simulations for 18th century, late 18th century, for the age of Mozart, suggest that the number of listeners of this music in late 18th century was, well, 2% of Europeans. And this situation did not change so much about effectiveness of our education. I I think that that what will happen, and this only my guess, would be a future, even further going differentiation, as even the bigger numbers of different incomparable models of making music, listening to music, as but not an elimination of the modes already existing, as they will probably still have their audience. So in short, I would prophesize, if I have some of further differentiations, appearing of new artistic and commercial niche, etc., but not an elimination of any already existing forms.
Thank you.
So the last question. Yes. I, of course, even though I raised two classical musicians, I feel sort of distant from this discussion. But I'm reminded of the story of the origin of Greek music, which is when Pythagoras hears the person hitting the anvil and makes a relationship between the weight of the anvils and the sounds that please the ear, and then this turned into it turned into this sort of aesthetic of whole numbers and relations of whole numbers. And what I was wondering, and then of course after Pythagoras there's Plato, and I'm wondering whether in the other traditions that you talk about, there are people that, or to which you compared the Western tradition, whether people make this jump from the music that they make and the music that they practice to the order of the larger world in the way that they, did in the West. That would seem very important. I mean, then music becomes one of the liberal arts for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and this kind of theoretical dimension of music gets a cosmological validation. And I think that the simple question that I wanted to ask was whether this happens elsewhere.
First, I would emphasize very strongly that music was a part of Artes Liberales as a general theory of harmonies, all the harmonies, and not theory of the art of sound, as we call it. Even in 11th century, as Guido of Arezzo, when he describes forms of music, he describes philosophers researching the order of things, including the order of sounds. But when he's going to practicing musicians, singers, and instrumentalists, he commends them with very short quasi-indefinitur bestia. They do not differ from the beasts. And of course, they are not included to Artes Liberales, which is a speculation. And this is probably specific for the West, while the link between cosmology and the concepts of music is far away from being something specifically Western. In ancient China, for example, this link is even much stronger than in the West, although differently understood, because it is not only the ontological or metaphysical link, but it is also a political, as the new cosmos, new order of the world is connected with every new dynasty. So when a new emperor starts a new dynasty, he also starts with establishing a proper order of music, changing the measure of intervals, the composition of the scale, because he as a person is a central point of the universe, and all the harmonies is built around the son of the heaven. Excuse me? Of course.
But I'm also thinking one thing, harmony is, the metaphor there is furniture making, fitting things together, making wheels, so that it's not really a visual metaphor, it's a kind of manual, tactile metaphor that is applied. Harmony then becomes harmony in music, and then it becomes the harmony in the cosmos, the artificial thing that the demiurge makes, and then it sets off in this
in its cosmological direction. But the metaphor is carpentry.
I think we could find many more of such examples, going from northern and southern India, to Korea, to classical Persia. I would omit Arab word, as their concepts of music were always the reinterpretation of Greek philosophic concepts, and they are simply indebted very strongly in all the Mediterranean philosophical tradition. But we could even move far away from the circle of so-called great civilizations. We could, for example, move to American Great Plains, to Arapaho, to find the concept of harmony that is both aural and visual, and it is also of non-natural origin, as it is being given to a person during the vision quest, as a kind of personal discovery, although those concept is very interestingly different, as there is no concept of general laws of harmony. They are personal, given individually to different persons during their own experiences.